Okay, welcome everyone to the Divorce Hour, my weekly podcast. And today I have Brendan Dillon from Dillon Solicitors. He's going to talk us through some of the legal parts, one of the key issues he's seen in divorce in Ireland at the moment. And also he comes from a cooperative divorce lawyer background and a mediator. So he's going to explain to us what cooperative divorce is like. So welcome, Brendan. How are you?
Good morning, Mel. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. I'm very well, despite the weather and lockdown and everything. Yes, I've practiced family law for probably about 25 years at this stage. And I suppose in many ways, it's hard to believe that not a lot has changed in that time as to the difficulties that couples experiencing going through the family law process. About 10 years ago, I trained to be a mediator for two reasons. One, to give me a much better insight even from a negotiation point of view as a solicitor, but also to understand the skills of seeing and being able to persuade your clients to see things from their spouse's perspective. I also trained as a collaborative lawyer, and for those who aren't aware of that process, it's essentially a lawyer-assisted mediation. Clients sometimes feel a little bit alone in a mediation. They feel it's just them and their spouse and one neutral person who they fear might actually be persuaded by the charm of their husband or wife, as the case may be. Whereas collaborative law involves both sides having their lawyers, but in a situation where they are committed to trying to reach an agreement, and there can be no threat of court. There must be full disclosure of financial. And one of the key elements of this process is very often we will bring in people like yourself, people with expertise in relation to parenting, and let the experts look after the issues in relation to assisting the couple forming a parenting plan, and let us deal with the financial and maybe the harder issues, if you like.
Yeah, and that's where the divorce coach comes in. We take the emotional piece and help guide the clients towards kind of a more fulfilled life afterwards and a future vision past that dark space they're in towards what it is they want in their lives. And then you would then take that and try and build that into the cooperative divorce process and all the legal documents, so that
Absolutely.
Both sides kind of are happier with the end solution and there's a more effective co-parenting and financial agreement in the end. And the children then are in a much better place. So instead of all the different fighting and pushing and pulling, everyone kind of comes out, with some kind of win solution.
There's no doubt about that. And of course, there are many cases where we have to go down an adversarial route because unfortunately the relationship between the couple is broken down. But it is the option of last resort and should be for couples, and everybody should look at ways in which they can try and resolve their differences. And I have no doubt that if couples sat down with their children and with the reality of separation, their children would vote for an agreed parenting plan every single day of the week. And sometimes, sadly, couples get, I suppose, bogged down in the issues which have divided them rather than the one thing that should bring them together, which is the love that they both have for their children.
Yeah. And did you see that as the main topic of conversation then with the children?
There is no doubt that every parent, whether it be a father or a mother, is devoted to their children and wants what's best for their children. Sadly, a couple that are breaking up don't obviously agree as to what is best for their children. And it is very sad to see certain situations, and I say certain situations, it doesn't happen all of the time, and it is probably a minority of situations, where a situation which may have prevailed pre-breakup, where both parents would have been involved with the children, and post-breakup, one of the parents may see the other parent in a completely different light, and in some way sort of danger to the children, which of course is not the case, or usually not the case. And that's where they need to take a deep breath and step back and say, what would the children want here? And there is no expert, and I'm sure you will endorse this, there's no expert that will not say that the children need a healthy and constructive relationship with both parents.
I definitely agree. And I think that's what, if you can agree that just put the children front and center focus, in the end, the research shows that it's beneficial for the children to have access to both of their parents in their lives. They need the father figure as well as the mother figure in their lives. And sometimes they'll get more one-on-one time after the divorce, after the separation and divorce, because they have that one-on-one time with parents. And that can be the benefit of the separation process, as we've discussed. But for sure, it's you have to think about the children, and also for each parent, it's also important to have your own space for yourself, because you need space to, deal with the overwhelm of the separation and divorce, and you need that time when you don't have the kids with you to look forward and plan the rest of your life and where you're going to go. Maybe go back and do some courses or look at how you're going to upskill in your work. You need that time just to have space for yourself, because trying to manage jobs and children and all the house chores can get a bit overwhelming after a while, on top of all the divorce process you're going through.
I think you're so right. And I think the point you make about both parents having time with their children, and sometimes, let me make this point. I think that it's a process of 3 to 5 years before a marriage comes to the point where one or other of the parties says it's over. So I don't believe that, and it's 25 years now since divorce came into this country. We don't have a mentality where if one party wakes up one morning and decide they want out of the marriage, they simply click their fingers and exit. It is a process, and a painful process for them. But I do believe that if that sad decision is made, that children are better in 2 happy houses than in 1 unhappy house. And I think living in an atmosphere which is dominated by friction and acrimony, that becomes their normality, and that's not a good normality for children to grow up with. And I also think, and I suppose I'm speaking not just as a lawyer but as a father, and trying to imagine myself in that situation, I think that fathers would probably have a better relationship, because they've got to make time for their children, and maybe they don't take that Saturday morning off to play golf when they actually spend it with their children, and both they and their children will be better for it. So I think there are positives, but the couples have to seek those positives and try and put their personal difficulties to one side and think of it through the children's eyes.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with you there, Brendan. I mean, I wouldn't be one to advocate for divorce at all. I've always, in my previous podcasts, I've showed people how they can, try and salvage their relationship and giving them advice about that. I know you help to mediate relationships too, but if children are in a household where there's so much fighting going on, it's awful for the children, because they grow up thinking that's the norm, and then they will recreate that in their relationships as well in the future. So sometimes divorce or separation is for the best. So tell us a bit more about mediation. How is that working at the moment in the current climate?
Obviously mediation is more challenging now. So I have done a number of mediations in lockdown, and they're done by Zoom, which is obviously difficult. But I think if parties engage constructively in the process, and most couples who engage in mediation genuinely want to try and resolve matters. So you're already well ahead in terms of trying to resolve matters. And I think that in some ways, because you set the ground rules early on, which is you invite each of them to come in at different times, sometimes there's less crossing over in terms of them trying to talk over each other that can sometimes have when you're on a face-to-face. So I've actually found that the couples listen to each other a little bit more. In some ways, the process actually forces them to do that. So it certainly better than the alternative. It sometimes, so a lot of the success of mediation is trying to analyze and work out the body language of the parties, and then and work through that dynamic. You lose a bit, obviously, in the Zoom process, but at the same time,
do you feel that if they, because they don't have that body language, do you feel that they communicate a bit better than with their words? Does that help?
I think that the most important quality and the route to the success of any mediation is the ability to listen.
Okay.
And I think if they, and obviously listening, you know, but hearing as well, that hearing what their husband or their wife is saying, and understanding that I don't have to agree. And I say to couples, this is not about agreeing with each other, but it's trying to understand why they are saying what they are saying, and then trying to reach a compromise somewhere. And this is all about compromise. I think if you can get couples to start off on that basis, then they have a great chance. And I think the other thing is, certainly from my point of view, I stress to them that don't see me as some form of arbiter or referee in this process. I'm here to facilitate you, but I don't make decisions. This is your process, and you're the ones that are going to reach an agreement and live this agreement if you can do so. And I think most couples will do that. And it's certainly my practice, as I'm sure of most mediators, to start with the children, and you will, I think, invariably end up with an agreement in relation to the children. And once you do that, the other issues, I'm not saying they're easy, but there is a greater incentive to try and agree the other issues, because they feel they've locked in on something which is a parenting plan for the children.
Okay, very good. So you talked about the children being one of the key items that gets discussed. What are the other key items that tend to need to get negotiated during a
Okay,
separation?
so I suppose there's probably 4 headings, if you like, the most important of which is, as we have discussed, issues with regard to the children. And very often, the other issues will, I'm not saying fall into line, but there's you certainly cannot resolve them without knowing what the position with regard to the children is. So the property being the obvious one. If there is one family home, no other property assets, then the options, I suppose, are the property is sold, the proceeds are divided, and then they've got to try and work out, and the division of the proceeds will usually be related to the ability of each of them to borrow and to be able to fund another property. So when courts are having to make decisions, their priority is to make sure that both spouses can reside in comfortable accommodation, and hopefully in accommodation that they can purchase. That's not always the case, and where it's not the case, then very often one of the spouses, usually the wife, may remain in the family home for a period of time. That's not ideal, because usually it will mean that the husband is left on the mortgage and then is constrained from being able to move on and purchase another property. And sometimes one of the spouses will buy out the other spouse, and then that releases that spouse from the mortgage, and then that spouse can take the lump sum from the buyout and purchase an alternative property. Property is certainly a significant topic. Another important issue is with regard to maintenance. So that can come in 2 forms. One, for the children, so there'll be an agreement if the children are primarily with one parent, and that would tend, if there's going to be a primary care, tend to be the mother, then the father will have to pay a sum of the maintenance, which is support for the expenses of rearing the children. And there is no, we don't have a formulaic way of such as in the UK, they have literally a formula for calculating maintenance. We don't have that here. So the court has to take into account what the needs of the children are, and the ability of the mother to fund those, and then the ability of the father, and in some way trying to come to a fair agreement between them. If the parents agree a 50-50 parenting arrangement, then generally they would simply create a fund and contribute, again based on their respective finances, to pay for things like medical expenses, dental expenses, education expenses, and whereas they then each fund the food and clothes for the children while they're with them. And if one of the parties has significant financial assets, such as lump sums, and that will be an issue that will need to be addressed. And the issue of pensions is always an issue that needs to be resolved. And particularly if one of the parties has, we'll say, and again, I'm without stereotyping this, but very often the mother may have given up work and sacrificed her career, and in those circumstances, the husband will have may have a significant pension. And if that is the case, the court, one of the factors that the court takes into account is the sacrifice made by the mother, and that should be taken into account in assessing what share of the pension should the other spouse, in this case usually the mother, have. So they are the kind of the main issues that need to be. Obviously, in relation to property, if there's investment, other assets other than the family home, they will also have to be addressed.
Okay, yeah. So it's kind of the children, the family plan and the financial plan, the two main ones.
And I suppose it is important to say that not one of these issues coexists on its own. They all link into each other. So it's a little bit like a jigsaw and trying to piece all the bits together.
Okay. And so what advice would you have for people who are maybe on the cusp of getting a separation or a divorce, and then for those who are in the middle of it and with the overwhelm at the moment?
Okay. So it's a really good question. So I would often meet with clients who are at the point where they're not sure, do they want to separate? They simply want advice in relation to their rights. And indeed, probably in the last couple of months, I've had at least 3 clients whom I might have seen 3 or 4 years ago. And they've now come back. I would have advised them initially, and they've now come back having made the decision that they don't see a future in their marriage. So what do I say to them? I say that nobody enters into marriage on the basis that they are going to end it at some stage. So it's a very, very, in many ways, a monumental decision to end the marriage. They usually come to see a solicitor at a point where they're very close, if they haven't already made their mind up. If they're still looking at ways, I will generally suggest that they will get some form of personal counseling, and that they will, because that's an area where we as lawyers don't have an expertise. And I will suggest to them they write down on a piece of paper the reasons they should stay in the marriage and the reasons they should leave the marriage. And I suggest to them that when they've done that and do that, if they do that really honestly, that'll probably tell them what they need to do.
Yeah, very good idea. It'll get it all out of them.
Yeah, I think sometimes just the piece of paper divided into why I want to stay in the marriage, why I want to leave the marriage, and it'll probably tell them.
And the importance of each, because you might have 2 on one side, but they're actually very important ones.
Absolutely. It's not just a numbers game. You're exactly right. Yeah, it's how significant those reasons are. Yeah.
And then for someone who's in the middle of it and going through some overwhelm, what would your guidance be?
So, as a solicitor, I say to clients at the outset of the process, this is going to be really difficult. Nobody would vote to go through this process, and my job is to try and bring them through that process with as little friction and as little acrimony as possible. But that's often not possible, and legal advice is expensive. There's an awful lot of advice that clients can get through coaches, counseling, to assist them to form a plan, because I really believe, and I do say this to clients, that this is a dark tunnel. You need to find light at the end of that tunnel. And the light at the end of that tunnel is usually easier to find when you have a plan. If you don't know where you're going, you are never going to get there. So I say to them, formulate a plan. Where do you visualize the parenting plan ending up at? Where do you see yourself living? Where do you see yourself working? I do say to mothers in particular, if they've had to give up work, that relying on their husband to pay maintenance is not a good place to be. Sometimes it's of necessity, particularly if the children are very young. But if they can get back to work, I say to them, I think it's better. I think it's better for you as a person. So I encourage them to make a plan.
Absolutely. Stand on your own 2 feet, no matter which parent it is. To stand on their own 2 feet, because sometimes the fathers also, with all the maintenance, are put in a very difficult position financially as well, and can't live in a nice place. Some of them have to go in shared accommodation because they can't afford all the maintenance, and that's very difficult.
And that's not good, and it's not fair for the children. That if, for instance, the mother is, let's say, for argument's sake, in the family home, the father is entitled to a comfortable place that the children are happy to visit him there. And it can be very prejudicial to fathers that sometimes the children just don't want to go on overnight stays for the reason that he just doesn't have the comforts. And that's not right. That's not a good position for the children to be. I think it can create confusion and conflicts with the children, and that's not good. They're not children forever. In a blink of an eye, they become adults, and now suddenly they've got to deal with all these conflicts that went on in their childhood. So I think that going back to, I think couples will do really well by availing of counselling, being able to talk to people about it. We have to advise clients they've got to be careful about discussing details with friends and family because of the in-camera rule, which is obviously a very strict rule about revealing details. So and that's where other professionals can come in to play.
And also sometimes family and friends, they want to help, but they might end up doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing or trying to act as mediators and revealing some information that they weren't supposed to, they didn't mean to. So it's good to have.
That is true. And they're not impartial. As helpful and supportive as they are, they're not impartial. And I think the most important thing is to look forward in 5 or 10 years' time and say, well, how did I get through this process? How did I minimize the impact on the children? And of course, in many cases, I might act for parties who are doing their best to achieve this, and the other spouse isn't. And that's a really, really difficult position to be in. And it's a difficult position to be in as an advisor, because you're telling your client to do the right thing, and yet it's almost as if it's been thrown back in their face. And that's a difficult position for them to be in. And you just have to say, look, your children will be the better for this, and hopefully in time your husband or your wife, as the case may be, will see a better way and change his or her ways also.
And that's what I do. I help empower my clients, I get them past that overwhelm towards that future vision of 5 years later, and that helps them understand what they need to negotiate for now, and just keeping that high road, and I help support them and build that support process so that no matter what they're getting attacked on from the other side, whatever buttons the other person knows how to press really well, they have a little wall, and they can just have a little bubble around themselves, protect themselves, knowing and holding that light at the end of the tunnel and that future vision all the way through. And it's hard, and sometimes the process takes a long time, so you need to have that set up all the way through.
It is hard, right? Was it Michelle Obama's book I read, that their philosophy was, when they go low, we go high. When they go lower, we go higher. But that's harder in practice.
And I think it's important for people to realize that this is just a wrinkle in time. It might be a couple of years, a year or two in your whole lifespan, right? So it's going to be tough. But if you build resilience, and there is the rest of your life to look forward to. So once you're past this, you'll be okay.
Actually, and that's a really good point. It shouldn't define the rest of their life. In many ways it creates opportunities, and it's a case of trying to grasp those opportunities. And move forward in a positive way. It doesn't have family breakup isn't all negative. It can actually be, and I don't mean this as in any way a glib comment, but when people come to see me, very often their mind is made up. Nobody ever comes back and says, I'm sorry, I actually made that decision. They've actually made the decision, and it's sad that it's come to that. It's now trying to make the best of what is a difficult situation, but many separation couples have a better life afterwards.
Yeah, and I can advocate for that. I'm in a lucky position where, despite going through a very controversial divorce, my ex and I are now, co-parenting very effectively together and are kind of friends.
Fantastic.
I'm not saying everyone's going to get to that.
No,
but that's
it's the goal. If that becomes your goal, it can be achieved.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for your time, Brendan Dillon, Brendan Dillon, Dillon Solicitors. So thanks very much for all that fantastic advice.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you, enjoyed it a lot.